Good morning and welcome to the Amaero International Investor Webinar. I'm Jane Morgan, the Investor and Media Relations Manager, and today I am joined by our Executive Chairman and CEO, Hank Holland. So last week, the company announced important milestones that included a binding offtake agreement and a $20 million capital raise led by Cornerstone institutional investors. Today's presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So to ask a question throughout today's webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Hank, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jane. 7 weeks ago, on 12 February, we held the last investor briefing. The briefing followed the lodging of a 17-page ASX announcement that provided an overview of Fairmont Consulting study, including estimated demand and growth for C103 AM powder, an overview of the supply landscape, and a survey of market pricing for C103 AM powder. During the investor briefing, we mentioned that we were advancing numerous high-value milestones, including a commercial offtake agreement for C103 with a strategic counterparty. We were pleased to share last week that Amaero signed a binding offtake and collaborative qualification agreement with a reference strategic counterparty. As I stated in the announcement, this is a very important milestone for Amaero. Amaero aspires to be the largest U.S. domestic producer of C103 and specialty alloy AM powders, and to be the most responsive, agile producer. In order to achieve manufacturing readiness and for additive manufacturing to achieve its potential, it's imperative that we stand up an alternative U.S. domestic supplier of C103 and specialty alloy powder. As it relates to the offtake agreement for C103 AM powder, the agreement is a binding contract with, and I quote from the cleansing statement, a leading deeply resourced additive manufacturer of C103 and refractory alloys for defense and space industries. The company has industry-leading technical and applied research capabilities, operating out of multiple locations in the United States, and collaborates with the U.S. Department of Defense-funded laboratories, as well as prime defense contractors. The agreement aligns Amaero with an industry leader to collaborate on qualification process in order that Amaero may accelerate its parameter optimization and expedite the qualification process for C103 powder. It's expected that Amaero will deliver C103 powder for testing in Q1 FY 2025. It's expected the qualification of C103 will be achieved in Q2 fiscal year 25. And subject to qualification, it's expected that 2 tons of C103 AM powder will be shipped over 4 quarters beginning Q3 FY 2025. Subject to qualification, a supply agreement will have a term for 5 years. Upon qualification of C103 powder, we expect to disclose the counterparty and to provide additional details of the agreement. The significance of the offtake agreement allowed Amaero to opportunistically complete a capital raise and to add strong institutional investors to the registry. As I commented in the announcement, the capital raise was well supported, with demand exceeding the $20 million placement. $17.5 million of the capital raise was committed from Cornerstone institutional investors. As Amaero's largest shareholder, I have often commented about the importance of attracting sophisticated, long-term shareholders to the registry, and the addition of these institutional investors is an important affirmation of Amaero's strategic direction and our execution to date. The capital raise was priced at 11% discount to the prior closing price and nil discount to the 30-day VWAP. The table on the left reflects the registry after the capital raise. I would highlight that the Cornerstone institutional investors will comprise 3 of the 7 largest shareholders. After the capital raise, Pegasus will hold approximately 35% of the total ordinary shares, and the top 7 shareholders will hold approximately 55% of the total ordinary shares. On the right, you see a graph of Amaero's share price over the past 52 weeks. Over this period, we took bold and decisive steps to restructure and reposition Amaero. In July of last year, less than 9 months ago, we announced the relocation to Tennessee, and we signed a long-term lease on a 9,300 square meter facility that was nearing completion. Without the relocation to the US and without the nearing completion facility, it would not have been possible to attract an industry-leading technical and powder production team, nor would it have been possible to pursue the C103 opportunity. After announcing the relocation to Tennessee, as we hired the executive team and as we interfaced with leading Department of Defense funded laboratories and prime defense contractors, the C103 opportunity emerged. As we sensed that Amaero was uniquely suited to capitalize on the opportunity, we acted boldly and decisively to position Amaero as the largest and most responsive U.S. domestic producer of C103, development of refractory alloys, and other high-value specialty alloy powders, and to position Amaero such that it played an important role in establishing manufacturing readiness that enabled the insertion of additive manufacturing and reshoring highly strategic industrial-based capabilities to the U.S., and to contribute to a more resilient, scalable supply chain for defense production and for the space economy. As you can see illustrated in the graph, Amaero stock 3DA has appreciated by 255% over the past 52 weeks. In addition to commenting on last week's announcement, I thought it'd be helpful to provide a corporate update and to point out important milestones on the horizon. Before we look forward, let's step back to revisit the opportunity and Amaero's strategic positioning. As I've shared in prior investor briefings, Pegasus' investment approach is to make high conviction investments in companies that are well positioned to benefit from macro themes with large secular tailwinds. As an example, weeks into COVID, Pegasus acquired controlling interest in a company called LogicSource from Bain Capital Ventures. The company provided an end-to-end supply chain solution and procurement service for companies such as McGraw-Hill, Rite Aid, Lululemon. The business had a very strong management team led by a hardworking, high-energy, driven founder CEO. And our bet was twofold. Number one, that supply chains and procurement would be deemed both strategic and critical as COVID exposed supply chain vulnerabilities. And number two, that the tireless, persistent efforts of the executive team would grow the business and capitalize on the opportunity. Both assumptions proved true in spades, and we sold the business in 23 months to a well-respected private equity firm in New York City for an 11x multiple on our investment. While waiting for the LogicSource sale to close and watching events unfold in the days after Russia invaded Ukraine, I traveled to Poland and Ukraine to start a nonprofit to evacuate vulnerable women and children. I traveled to Poland and Ukraine. I quickly teamed with some former SAS commandos, and we founded Project Apollo. We happened to be in Lviv, Ukraine on 13th of March when the first Russian cruise missile struck a large fuel depot about a quarter mile from the safe house where we were staying. That evening, while sheltered in a root cellar in my Kevlar helmet and vest, I had a vivid thought that all I had known my entire career were the forces of globalization and that it was over, that I would spend the rest of my lifetime winding the clock backwards, and that it would become a U.S. national strategic imperative to reshore critical industrial-based capabilities. When I arrived back in the U.S., I immediately began scouring platform companies that could benefit from the reshoring opportunity. There's a wonderful book, The Arsenal of Democracy by A.J. Bain, that describes the United States' epic quest converting its automobile and consumer durable enterprises to mass production of the B-24 bombers for World War II. Prior to the construction of Ford's Willow Run plant, the U.S. had no capacity to build bombers. By the end of the war, the Willow Run plant was turning out one bomber per hour. It's not hyperbole when I claim that the United States has the same challenge and the same opportunity today. This is truly a generational opportunity. And to my knowledge, Amaero is the only ASX listed company that sits at the nexus of the primary pillars of the reshoring effort: critical minerals and materials, advanced manufacturing, and defense production supply chain. Amaero provides a scalable capability that's at the fulcrum of the reshoring opportunity. And Amaero is uniquely suited to provide an alternative U.S. domestic production of C103 and specialty alloy powder that's both scalable and responsive to the immediate need for development, testing, and demonstration materials. In addition to the generational reshoring opportunity, there are powerful secular tailwinds that relate to the adoption of technology and large investment innovation cycles. The adoption of metal additive manufacturing has reached a tipping point. The accelerated adoption is driven by numerous factors, including advances in the technology, the increasingly complex geometry of in-part design, and the urgent need to replace castings and forgings with other manufacturing modalities. As for technological advances in 3D printers, improvements include the quality of optics and laser technology, as well as the increasing number of lasers, which results in faster printing cycle. The increasing size and volume of the printer axes, which results in the ability to print larger parts, and the improved software and computer-aided controls, which results in better quality control. As for the in-part geometry, the complexity of the geometry coupled with integrated features such as cooling channels is best suited for additive manufacturing. Finally, in the wake of the Ukraine conflict, the Department of Defense has identified U.S. domestic capacity for castings and forgings as one of the greatest risks to national security. In addition to providing a substitute for castings and forging, 3D printing allows for a much faster and iterative design, development, and demonstration cycle, and a shorter lead time for in-part manufacturing. Secular tailwinds are the result of a large, again, generational investment cycles in defense and in the space economy. As it relates to defense, there are two large investment themes: hypersonics and strategic missiles. As some of you may know, the US first developed hypersonic technology 2 decades ago. As an aside, hypersonic generally refers to speeds in excess of Mach 5, or 5 times the speed of sound. Notwithstanding the US's early development lead, both China and Russia have developed hypersonic weapons in recent years. This has created an incredible national defense vulnerability, and it's a top priority of the DoD to deploy offensive and defensive hypersonic capabilities as soon as possible. Another generational investment at DoD relates to intercontinental ballistic missiles. The current generation of ICBM technology, the Minutemen, was first deployed 6 decades ago. The DoD is replacing the Minuteman III platform with the Sentinel system. The budget for the Sentinel is estimated at $130 billion US over the next decade. In both cases, hypersonics and strategic missiles, the systems must operate at very high temperatures, thus requiring advanced high temperature materials. In parallel with the generational investment cycle in defense is the large investment innovation cycle in the space economy. Again, given the nature of the operating environment, space launch and satellite systems require advanced high temperature materials. The high temperature applications that are well suited for additive manufacturing include thermal protection and propulsion systems. The generational reshoring opportunity, the secular tailwinds relating to the adoption of metal 3D printing, the large investment cycle in defense and space, coupled with the experience of Amaero's technical and powder production team, and the capacity and capability of Amaero's next generation atomization technology, led us to a very intentional strategic positioning. Number one, as described, we're at the nexus of the US's strategic imperative to reshore critical industrial-based capabilities. Number two, with an industry-leading technical and powder production team and the expected commissioning of the first atomizer by the end of June, Amaero is positioned to have a first-mover advantage and a defensible competitive position. Number three, with the capital investments to date and the capital budget plan, Amaero expects to be the largest U.S. domestic producer of C103 specialty and titanium alloy powders. Number four, with intentional production planning, we expect to be a more responsive producer with shorter lead times and the flexibility to produce small batch specialty alloy powders. And finally, number five, with the next generation atomization technology, we expect to provide industry-leading yield of AM powder and with the capability of melting high temperature refractory alloys. Again, I'd like to reiterate the strategic position resulted from intentional, decisive actions. In recent announcements, I stated, we are strategically establishing a vital industrial capability that aligns with the U.S.'s paramount initiatives in advanced materials and manufacturing, while bolstering supply chain resilience for critical materials and aerospace and defense production. We took bold and decisive steps over the past year to position Amaero as the largest, most responsive U.S. domestic producer of C103 and other high-value specialty powders. Amaero has an opportunity to play an important role in reshoring highly strategic industrial-based capabilities to the U.S. and to contribute to a more resilient, scalable supply chain for defense production and the space ecosystem. Finally, let me touch on milestones, where we've been and what's on the horizon. Pegasus first invested in Amaero in May of 2022, a bit less than 2 years ago. In November of that year, I stepped in as chairman and CEO, and we commenced with the board an intensive corporate restructuring. In July of 23, as I mentioned, but 9 months ago, the strategic direction was set with key decisions throughout the calendar year that included our relocation to Tennessee, the signing of a long-term lease at our manufacturing and corporate facility, recruiting and hiring an industry-leading technical and powder production team, prioritizing production of C103 and specialty alloy powders, landing the first atomizer in Tennessee, and ordering the second atomizer. Thus far in calendar year 24, we concluded the Fairmont Consulting Group study. We commenced installation of the first atomizer. We signed a binding offtake and collaborative qualification agreement, and we concluded a $20 million institutional capital raise. Importantly, we have milestones on the horizon that include, as earlier communicated to investors, we expect to commission the first atomizer by the end of June. We expect to produce titanium 6-4 powder in conjunction with commissioning, and we will immediately begin collaborative qualification of Ti 6-4. We expect to commence C103 powder production and to collaborate on qualification with expedited iterative parameter optimization. Also, we expect to sign more offtake/commercial agreements with strategic counterparties, including the Department of Defense funded laboratory and other well-placed commercial participants. The above milestones will be transformative, and we expect that they will all be achieved before the end of the calendar year. As previously communicated, we expect commercial sales of C103 specialty and titanium alloy powders to commence the first quarter of calendar year 2025, and we expect to achieve positive EBITDA in calendar year 2025. I hope this has been a helpful overview, and I would be happy to take questions. Before I turn it back to Jane, I thought I would address a couple of questions that I have received from investors. The first, why didn't Amaero lodge a typical ASX announcement, and why wasn't the counterparty named? With lodging the cleansing statement, Amaero was disclosing all information to investors that was materially price sensitive. As described, the counterparty is a leading and deeply resourced additive manufacturer of C103 and refractory alloys for the defense and space industries. As the offtake is conditional upon qualifying C103 powder, we plan to announce the counterparty and to share other details in the agreement upon achieving qualification. Question number 2 that I received. Does the announced binding offtake agreement give the counterparty any exclusivity to Amaero product or otherwise restrict Amaero from pursuing other offtake agreements? The agreement does not provide counterparty with exclusive access to Amaero product, nor does it preclude Amaero from pursuing other offtake agreements. In fact, Amaero expects to sign an offtake commercial agreement with a leading Department of Defense funded laboratory and expects to sign offtake commercial agreements with other additive manufacturers. With that, Jane, I'll turn it back to you for other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hank, and thank you all for joining us. If you do have questions for Hank, please use the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. Hank, there's a couple that are popping up. Give me one moment. Okay, so can you please clarify if the $20 million raise takes you through to break-even EBITDA? And secondly, could you please provide more color around the C103 and Ti 64 powder qualification process?
Okay, so I've got these written down. If I miss something, Jane, please remind me. So in the ASX announcement that we lodged, I believe it was 7 weeks ago, on the Fairmont study, we provided, and I recognize this is probably more than is often the case with smaller ASX companies, we provided granularity of CapEx that we will need all the way through fiscal year 28. And that was a total of $76 million Australian, if I am correct by memory. Pretty sure that's right. Through through calendar year 25, that is another 9 months of this calendar year, 12 months of next calendar year, so a little bit less than 2 years. We will need less than that. And as I mentioned, in calendar year 25, we do expect to be EBITDA positive. Your question is the Australian $20 million capital raise that we just completed, will that be enough to take us to break-even operations? No, we do not expect that it will, but we are nearing the end of our capital raise and we expect to be fully funded. What we announced in the recent announcement and the recent investor briefing as well is that $76 million we would expect to be funded from equity capital raises, from capital equipment secured debt, and from federal grants. And we estimated that you could think of the equity portion of that is a bit more than half. I don't think we gave a precise number. And moreover, at about the same time, we have announced that we have retained Guggenheim, one of the premier M&A advisors in the US, to advise us on strategic capital sources. That was partly in response to receiving unsolicited inbound interest. An important thing to note, and I want to get to the question explicitly, but this is hopefully helpful background. It will be necessary that greater than 50% of our shareholder base are US investors. Why will that be necessary? 2 reasons. One of which is we have, as we prior announced, we are pursuing federal grants and we are advancing that process. Those federal grants will require that we are greater than 50% US shareholder owned, number one. Number two, albeit we're not prepared to disclose the details, we have been asked by a US DoD entity if we would consider standing up part of our facility to be classified. And we are exploring that as well. That would also require that we are 51% US shareholder owned. So all of that is a way of saying we do not expect that we will have any more primary capital raises in Australia. So we expect our capital raises in Australia have finished with this Australian $20 million raise, and that the next equity capital raise would be strategic in nature. And when I say strategic, I mean US industry participants. Think of these as prime defense contractors. Think of this as first-tier suppliers. Think of this as material companies and or financial sponsors, right? Think private equity and other investors in the US. My guess is that we would have one more raise sometime later this year in the US. And at that point, we would be fully funded from an equity perspective. The second question, C103 qualification. So let me ask the question generically as far as qualifying powder in general, and then I'll comment more specifically on C103. In general, when you're qualifying powder, it's a matter of chemistry as well as morphology or properties of the powder. So particle size distribution, the shape of the powder, that it's regular, that you don't have satellites or attachments, if you will, the porosity of the powder, that is, you don't have capture of oxygen or air inside the powder, the oxygen content. So all of these things that are in general tests that are done to the powder. And in the case of something like Ti-64 or super nickels or stainless steel, that's all that would be done because you have a fairly extensive database on the properties for all those powders. And so what we would expect is we'll commission the atomizer by the end of June. The protocol of commissioning the atomizer, because at the time we planned to produce titanium 6-4 and Ti alloys, we will qualify, or we will commission the atomizer with titanium. So we will make titanium powder. I've said I expect we'll complete that by the end of June, which implies we expect to make titanium powder by the end of June. We will immediately advance that to qualification. And given the partner we've signed the offtake agreement with and the collaborative qualification agreement, I would expect that would be done in fairly short order. If we were going otherwise to industry, it would take much, much longer, okay? Specific to C103, because you have less of a database, it will be the same powder properties, the same chemistry, the same type of testing that would be done for other things. On top of that, because we'll want to gather data, we will likely print coupons. Think of this as just nothing but a small block or a piece of C103 that's printed that we could do certain physical tests on. And so we would likely do other physical testing in addition to the chemical property testing. And the arrangement that we have, which again we've announced with our collaborative qualification partners, is we have developed a process. And what will be unique about this process is we will essentially have a feedback loop. So we will provide them powder, they will test it, they'll quickly provide us the results. We will then iterate our parameter optimization process. We'll provide the next powder, they'll test us, they'll provide the results. And this iteration, if you will, should provide for a much more expedited process to qualify the powder. And once we do qualify the C103 powder, the nature of our offtake partner and who this is, we expect will essentially be the gold standard, right, for qualifying that powder. The last thing I would add, albeit it wasn't asked, I've mentioned that we expect to sign an offtake / powder production agreement with a DoD-funded laboratory. I would say that party as well will be very, very important in the ecosystem of hypersonics and strategic missile. So having them also qualify our powder will be another strategic component as well.
Thank you, Hank. In fact, that actually does bring me to the next questions. There's quite a few coming through just on offtakes, how many we'd ideally like to see and the timing for those. So perhaps if you want to comment on that.
Yep. So, there's only so much we could say before we announce this. I tried to allude to this in earlier announcements. When we've been trying to get an offtake agreement, what I'm not interested in essentially is essentially or simply getting a purchase order, right? C103, you have very few, I mean very few, as in essentially singular, okay, parties that have qualified C103. And so for us to qualify C103 and for us to establish a database associated with that qualification is going to put us in the middle and in a very, very attractive position as far as advancing development, advancing demonstration, and eventually be in a position to participate in the production cycle of these various projects, right? So what we're looking for before and what we were looking for going forward is not simply a purchase agreement, but something that is strategic in nature and not only creates offensive capabilities for us to participate in these systems, but also importantly creates these defensive moats, right? This defensibility of our first mover advantage for a period of time. And when I say a period of time, what will be critical is the next 18 to 24 months. Because in the next 18 to 24 months, you will transition these programs from development and demonstration to production, right? And not that there won't be other opportunities 2 years and 3 years and 4 years from now, but these opportunities will be done. When it comes to hypersonics, when it comes to strategic missiles, the train will have left the station. The opportunity largely will have been accounted for. And again, there will be other opportunities, but these generational opportunities will be largely spoken for.
Wonderful, Hank. Look, that's all the questions we've got now, but perhaps just to reiterate to our webinar attendees on the call, and I know you did cover this in your presentation, but what should they be looking forward to over the next 3 to 6 months from a news flow perspective?
Yeah, and I think that our history suggests, and one should anticipate this continue, that we have given guidance in the past that we're confident we can beat. And so what I stipulated very clearly is milestone number 1, we expect to commission our atomizer by the end of June. During that period, we will produce Ti-64 powder. Okay. We've stated that we're on or ahead of schedule with the installation and commissioning of the first atomizer. Thereafter, we have stated the first quarter of the fiscal year, so you're now in the July, August, September quarter, we expect to begin C103 powder production, provide powder for testing purposes, and begin to collaborate with our partner in this iterative process of optimizing our parameters to advance to qualifying that C103. And what I've announced in the call today is we would expect to qualify that C103 in the second quarter of fiscal year 25. Okay. So all of these things we'd expect to be completed by the end of the calendar year, and then start next calendar year in full-blown commercial production of C103, of specialty alloys, and of Ti 6-4.
Thank you for that, Hank. Actually, there's a couple more questions that have just popped up here now. So, being US domiciled, operating the US and needing to be over 50% US owned, when are we likely to switch reporting to USD?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll tell you the way we manage the company today is USD. As an example, we obviously will settle this capital raise in Australian dollars. We will immediately convert to US dollars, right? We will match our liabilities, our assets, our revenue, our expenses to US dollars. We have no expenses to speak of that remain in Australian dollars, and thus we won't take that risk. Obviously, that may well require then a mark-to-market adjustment in our financials that we report, right? We'll report in Australian dollars for the time being. But for practical purposes, we will match our currency that we hold with our assets, liabilities, with our revenue and our expenses. As you know, in Australia, the convention is to report in Australian dollars on a June 30 fiscal year basis. It is more common, of course, in the US to report in US dollars on a calendar year basis. And so right now, we essentially run two sets of our financial model, and we run two sets of financials internally. The US parties that we will be speaking to on the strategic capital raise, those conversations will be US dollar calendar year, right? So back to the question, which is an astute question, is will we, while listed on the ASX, change our reporting protocol to US dollar and perhaps even a calendar year? And maybe it wasn't asked, but I would add to that a related question. At what point might we list on a US exchange as a dual listing or primary listing? None of those decisions the board has made at this point. I think at this point, it's easy enough to report in Australian dollars. It's easy enough to report on a fiscal year and yet have parallel conversations with US stakeholders in US dollars on a calendar year basis.
Wonderful, Hank. That actually answered the second question. So I think that's all we have today. So thank you all for joining us. If we have missed any of your questions, please feel free to reach out via the contact details, which are at the bottom of our ASX releases. Hank, thank you for the great presentation, and we look forward to hosting you all again next time.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you, everyone. Take care.